Yeah, and I was just about to go to prehab when you mentioned it. So this showing that slow, heavy loads are good for rehab. How would you say should people do prehab? So should they do actually slow, heavy loads to prevent injuries?
Yeah, so my specialty is working with runners, and this is a really nice topic that I like to get involved in because a lot of runners are a little bit apprehensive to start strength training. All they want to do is run because they're like, I'm training for a marathon. All I need to do is run. I need to get really, really good at running in order to perform really well for the marathon. But there's a lot of research out there to show that you can increase your risk of injury because if all you're doing is running, then it's going to increase your likelihood of an overuse injury because you're doing that same thing over and over again. But there's really good evidence to show that strength training and strength and conditioning helps running performance, and that helps endurance performance. So it goes against the grain, or it goes against the initial thought that why would lifting heavy help me perform at an endurance event? Just doesn't make sense. I should just be doing more endurance-based stuff. But there's some really nice research out there to point towards, yes, you need to strength train twice a week. It'll help shift your loads, but you will get stronger, more resilient, and able to perform at endurance events better. And then, a runner will eventually get convinced, okay, let me start strength training. And then they just do the stuff they're good at, which is the body weight exercises. They do calf raises, squats, lunges, 3 sets of 30 reps because that's what they're good at. But again, the research will show that if you compare a group of marathon runners to do strength training, which is just involving body weight, compared to a bunch of marathoners that are doing heavy strength work and plyometric exercises, they will outperform in that marathon compared to those who do the body weight stuff. So very important.
Yeah. And how would you say, like, if you think classic strength training for performance, usually you should do it rather fast because we are moving fast, whether it's running or different sports. And then for the tendons, we actually want slow and heavy. So how would you recommend training for performance versus prehab?
For performance, you want to train twice a week. And as you get stronger, so you might need to start with body weight. If you've never done strength training in the past, you'll probably need to start with body weight because, again, we don't want an abrupt change that your body's been like, that's too much, let me get injured. But if you start body weight and have the progressions to slowly build up your strength, most of it would be slow, heavy, controlled stuff. It would be squats, lunges, deadlifts, calf raises that are heavy enough that around about 8 to 10 reps is really challenging. And so a lot of people do 10 reps, have a rest, but it doesn't really challenge them. By the ninth rep, it should be really, really tough. By the 10th rep, it's probably close to your max. You probably could push out 11 or 12 if you really tried, but you stop short of 10 and then you do 3 or 4 sets of that. That's the bulk of your intensity for your strength training. But then if everything's going really well, you can then supplement some plyometric stuff on top of that. Maybe 10% of your strength training can be plyometric stuff. And that's a pretty nice icing on the cake for performance. And usually I guess it is for performance, but it's also for prehab as well. It's also for, if you operate within those dosages, you are reducing your risk of injury in the future. You are becoming a little bit more resilient as a runner and receiving the performance benefits at the same time. So I believe the prehab and the strength and conditioning for performance can be like the same thing.
And you said that maybe you start in the beginning with the body weight and you progress. How about in the other end, where a person is doing quite heavy strength training, and if you want super strong tendons that can take anything, how would you do? Would you go to eccentric ones, just like, for example, few repetitions, really heavy, like maybe supramaximal loads? What would you think? How do the tendons respond if you can take the load?
I think if you're doing really well and you're kind of at that high end of very experienced with your strength training, but also you do want to run and you do want to perform as a runner, you can then probably supplement, or you can be a little bit creative with how you load things. Like you can have a strong concentric phase and a slow eccentric phase for your certain things. So maybe once every 2 weeks, instead of just your normal deadlifts, you can then supplement really slow eccentric deadlifts with a really fast concentric phase. So you're going down really slowly and then coming up in a really fast movement. So then you're sort of training or triggering your tendons to adapt a certain different way. Just keeping the body guessing with some more difficult plyometric style exercises. That would just create a lot more strength for your tendons. But then you can just also, if you didn't want to be that creative, just be progressive. Just be progressive with your slow, heavy stuff. It doesn't need to be complicated. I usually say that with strength training, and people ask what's like the secret sauce of strength training. It can be super simple if you want it to be, but it can also be really complicated if you want it to be. And so the simple one, which I've said before, I'll say it again, is just squats, lunges, calf raises, deadlifts. Hover around the 3 sets of 8 to 10 and progress the weights as the body adapts and gets stronger, and as you can tolerate heavier weight. That's all you need to do if you wanted to prehab your stuff, if you wanted to increase your running performance, and you wanted to just be a little bit more resilient as a runner.
So quite classic bodybuilder style strength training in a way, like three sets of about 10.
I think if we're doing, say, strength training twice a week, I think a bodybuilder would be a lot more frequent than twice a week.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But yeah, it can just be as that. I also think, say, power lifters, they operate with lower reps. They'll do like every now and then test their 1 rep max or 3 or 4 rep max, those sort of things. Because a lot of fear that runners have is they fear that they're going to become a big, bulky athlete that's going to diminish their running performance, because they look at bodybuilders or they look at power lifters and say, that's not a runner. Like that, look how heavy they are, look how inflexible they are, look how much muscle mass they have. I want to be lean, because lean is performance when it comes to running, which is true. But if you are strength training twice a week, but then running 4, 5, 6 times a week, it's going to be so hard for you to put on muscle mass. But also the diet side of things as well. Like if someone wants to put on muscle mass, they're eating enormous quantities, which a runner wouldn't do, because their goal isn't to put on muscle mass. And so my advice for those people is that as long as you do your cardio as the bulk of your training throughout the week, and you eat the same volumes, or you just don't train with the same qualities that a powerlifter would, it's going to be very, very hard for you to put on muscle mass. You might put on a couple of pounds here and there, which is probably going to be advantageous for your performance, but you definitely wouldn't get that big, bulky body. It's impossible. It would defy physics.
Yeah, I fully agree. And about the strength training exercises, it's quite easy to figure out what to do for the knee and hip joints, but how would you say for the foot, for example, to prevent plantar fasciitis? What kind of exercises you would recommend? I think it's a little bit more tricky how to load
it. There is some good research, but just low sample sizes of doing calf raises with the toes in extension. So you do either double leg or single leg calf raises with, say, a towel or a foam padding underneath all the toes. So the toes are actually a little bit more pointing up towards the roof. And then you're coming up into a calf raise, and that will load up the fascia more so than if the toes were just flat on the ground. So doing that can kind of bias the fascia, but then you just want to increase the strength and function of the foot, which can be as simple as getting better at barefoot walking, getting better at being in the gym and having either minimalist footwear or no footwear at all. So if you do lunges, squats, calf raises without shoes on, and you work within your adaptation zone and progress from there, then your foot is naturally getting stronger. Your foot is naturally increasing its level of function, and would then help that plantar fasciitis move along. In terms of its pathology, will help progress that. But, sometimes it's finding a starting point, because sometimes someone might do some squats in bare feet, and then all of a sudden their fascia's flared up, and it's like, okay, that was way too much. Let's try and find a new starting point for you. So everyone fits on their starting point is on a different spectrum, and it's finding that starting point can be quite tricky. But eventually that end goal, if you're talking about what can we do, what are specific exercises, it can just be just performing with more minimalist footwear and just having your foot be capable of doing it all without the support. That can be very good for both strength and function.
And I think many of our listeners of this podcast are passionate runners, and I'm pretty sure each one of them is getting 1 year older every year, and maybe a little bit older age, even though I don't have the statistics. What would be your recommendations or notes for aging runners, how to take advancing age into account with your training?
My first tip is accept that age is a quality. Like a lot of people, runners in their 50s, they try and train like they were in their 30s. They're like, I want to get back to that. You're just defying physics. It's inevitable that your body will, as it ages, diminish in, say, VO2 max. It will be just, your runs will then feel tougher. It's just natural progression. However, there's some really nice studies to show that the more active you are, the slower that decline of fitness. So you do diminish your VO2 max and you do diminish these other aerobic qualities, but it's at a slower degree the more active you are compared to those who are maybe a little bit more inactive as the decades go on. So my advice is don't defy physics and try and train like you were in your 30s, because then it's just going to continue. You'll continue overloading your body and develop an injury and just have this boom-bust cycle. And make sure that you prioritize recovery as well. We know that as you get older, it takes longer for you to bounce back from a session. So if you do a hard exercise session in your 30s, you might take, a day or so to recover, and then you're good to go again. Whereas in your 50s, you might take 2 days. It just might take a little bit longer. That's just the natural progression. Some other practical takeaways would be to strength train, definitely strength train, because we know that the tendons lose their stiffness, they lose their quality to produce force, and that is preserved more if you do strength training. So you're more likely to just have greater capacities of your muscles and your tendons to perform, but also to reduce your risk of injury. Particularly the calves, particularly if you're in your 40s and 50s, particularly if you're male, strengthen your calves, strengthen your Achilles. That's one of the muscles that gets atrophied the most, and people lose their speed and they turn into more of a shuffle. Their cadence stays the same or increases, but their step length reduces, so they turn into a bit more of a shuffle. And a lot of the time is because they don't strengthen their calves enough, and that just diminishes. Which is another tip as well when it comes to if you are advancing into your 40s and 50s, is you can still do interval training. You just need to be more careful with how you do it. And it's encouraged that you do strength. It's encouraged that you do these short interval stuff, maybe hill sprints, maybe just shorter efforts of 200 meters, 400 meters, or like 500, a K. Just start training with higher intensities so that you are triggering your body to adapt to those intensities. It's very hard for people in their 50s. Well, it's very natural for a runner in their 50s just to slowly start to back off the intensity, and then all of a sudden all you're doing is just really low intensity stuff, and you become more vulnerable to overuse injuries because you're not triggering that upper intensity sort of stuff, and you do turn into more of a shuffled run because you're not introducing those higher intervals regularly. So make sure it's a part, make sure it's in there, make sure you strength train, prioritize the calf strength, just mix up the intensities here and there, and just trying to not defy the nature of aging. Respect the recovery process, respect that you will slowly decline in your VO2 max and you can't train like you did 20 years ago. And yeah, you'll be able to thrive a little bit better, I'd say.
Yeah, great points. And I think this has been really good kind of condensed information. If we go a little bit, you have a lot of great resources on your website and on your podcast. And you, for example, have a free ebook, The Universal Principles to Overcome Any Running Injury. Could you tell a little bit about the book and where people can find this one?
Sure. So my idea with starting the podcast was to start with these universal principles. And so that turned into the first 10 episodes of my podcast. So episode 1 to 10 covers the 10 universal principles to overcome injury. And I made an ebook alongside that. So it was, if you just like listening to podcasts, you can just go and listen to that. But if you want a little bit more detail, if you want to see a lot of the graphs and things that I include in that, I have a Run Smarter app. You can just type in Run Smarter and that app will pop up. And in the More section, it will say the ebook. It's totally free, so you can just sign up and get access to that ebook. So 10 universal principles that I believe that all runners need to know to reduce their risk of injury significantly and overcome a current injury that they're struggling with. And so those 10 universal principles as an ebook or as in a kind of podcast format, whatever they so desire.
Yeah, I skimmed through the book and I think it's very good with the graphs and I've been working with the sports scientist a long time. I have met a lot of them, and I think even most of them don't always understand their injuries. Like even this kind of basic ebook. So if you're a sports scientist, it might be useful to check the book because usually sports scientists are more about performance and not about injury prevention. So I really encourage, you don't even need to provide email. You can just click on the website and download it. And could you tell what was the website?
So my website is runsmarter.online, and it has my podcast episodes, my blogs, a few bit of research papers here and there. And if people want to learn more, they can go there.
Yeah, that's really good. And you have worked with a lot of runners, so you really know what you think. If people are struggling with an injury and would like to consult you, how does it work?
One of the easiest ways, I made this super simple, is to go to the website, and on the website there's a button to say click here for a free 20-minute injury chat. And so a lot of my podcast listeners are heading on there. I'm jumping on maybe 2 or 3 injury chats a day, just having a free injury chat just to either break up or try and uncover what's contributing to this injury or some tips that you can do to overcome the injury. But I'm also an online physio that works with runners, and we can also discuss, if you wanted to start working together, exactly what that looks like. And so most people just start working with me through the injury chat, and whether they want to just take away some tidbits and knowledge within that chat, that's fine. But if they also want to work together, I'd explain exactly how that works, because online working together might be a little bit confusing for some, and my process is a little bit different than perhaps other online physios. And so I like to break it down on that call as well.
And how many consultations you have per day? These 20 minutes thing, how full is your day?
At the moment, I'm hovering around 3 or 4 injury chats per day. And, my caseload with the current runners I'm working with is hovering around 30 or 35 runners as we speak, which are on different package durations. That some are working with for a week, some a month, some 6 months. And so, I keep busy.
And maybe there's some physios or other professionals listening this. I think you have made pretty nice way of marketing your knowledge and pretty nice funnel of people finding you and becoming your customers. So could you tell a little bit of this story before we finish? After graduating, how did you build this nice podcast and these materials, and what has been the experience and maybe takeaways from it?
I think one of the major things that I did was just follow my passion and trying to gravitate towards what gives me energy rather than depletes my energy. And I spent a long time working in private practice, just as an employee, spent a long time liking certain clientele, not enjoying other clientele. There were definitely some people that I had to treat, which depleted my energy. But then the runners that I would see, because I'd be so passionate about running, they would generate my energy. And I could see runners all day with zero burnout. And so recognize that this is what I love doing. I love teaching. I love learning about running. I love assessing runners, treating runners, getting them back to pain-free stuff. I love recognizing that there's a gap between like so many misconceptions, and there's a gap between what runners should know and what they do know, and just self-reflection, just, seeking out what I really love doing and what the world needs, and then just following that. And so that's carried me over into starting my own clinic, the Run Smarter Physio Clinic, starting the podcast, the Run Smarter podcast, and just building up from that. And so the passion comes across, the people, the feedback that I get is, you just have so much energy all day, and that's just because I've chose the group of people to work with that just generate my energy rather than deplete my energy.
Yeah, I think it's really nice that you kind of find what you like and create your own niche, and then you can meet only those customers and do all the material related to that. Could you tell a little bit about how was the process of starting a podcast? How was the learning process? I think many of the professionals are thinking, but yeah, that's Brodie. He's great doing that. I'm not like that. What would be your encouraging words for people thinking that they cannot do the same as you do?
Yeah, I think for the first 5 years of my physio career, I thought to myself, I'm not cut out to be a leader or a speaker or educate people. I'm not that eloquent with how I speak. I'm not that knowledgeable with what I know. And there was a lot of doubts, but you start somewhere. Like, I didn't actually start with the Run Smarter podcast. I started with this podcast a few years prior called the Everyday Running Legends, where I would just interview everyday runners. I wouldn't even position myself as a physio. I'd just be the interviewer, just asking runners about really interesting stories that they had, and just trying to spark motivation in other listeners. And so it just started from there. Like, starting a podcast it can be really easy, but there can be a lot of steps if you need it to be. Choosing the right microphone, or what questions to ask, or editing your own software, or what platform should you use. All these sort of things can be quite complicated, but once you learn it, I think the barrier to entry is more psychological than anything. I know a lot of people have a lot of self-doubt about doing it, but you just take a small little step. Maybe there's a bit of fear involved, but you just take that step, and then all of a sudden it's really easy. Like, going from that first podcast to starting my second podcast was the easiest transition in the world, because I've already had all of that knowledge backed up. That steep learning curve at the start was just like minimal, making that transition to the second podcast. And it was only because I started, and that momentum just carried. And then just sort of self-reflecting, how do I get better? How did that interview go? How should I improve? What information do I think carried across really well? How should I phrase it a little bit differently next time? It's all those self-reflection type of things that just carry over. And I'm still learning today. I claim I don't know everything. I claim that I am very passionate about it, and I'm willing to change my opinions on a lot of things as I learn more. And that's another thing that's carried over. Like, from episode 1 to now episode 210, I've learned so much because I've interviewed so many people. I've interviewed so many health professionals and researchers and running coaches that I've changed and morphed my opinion on certain things, and built up a lot of examples, a lot of just concepts that resonate really well. One of the feedbacks that I get from runners is like, you explain things really well, but really simply, and I kind of get it, and I resonate with it really easily. And that's just taken a lot of self-reflection on my behalf to deliver that eventually.
Yeah, I really like your points. And like you said, that you thought first that you're not the one to be expert, you're not the one to teach. But basically, I think as an encouragement for other people also, that you don't need to be it now. You can decide that you will be that after 100 episodes, when you have done 100 expert interviews and asked everything you don't know. So it can be a goal in the future that you decide that then I will know this, and you find your small niche. You can, for example, if as a physio, you can specialize to just one joint, one problem, and there's so many people in the world as you can now do it with online things. So I would really encourage. I think it's the modern technologies are so great. But yeah, we have talked now 1 hour, so I think it's time to wrap up. Do you have any final remarks? What would you like to say before we finish?
Yeah, thanks. I think if anyone wants to learn more, I think they can just start with going to the Run Smarter podcast. They can start with those 10 episodes, those 10 universal principles to reduce your risk of injury. And usually if you want to learn more, it just flows on from there. Like you can listen to more episodes, you can then get the app, you can then join the Facebook group. But I think it all just starts off with just listening to the podcast and investing in your own knowledge. Even for health professionals that are listening to this episode, I interview a ton of other researchers and podiatrists and chiros and physios that have changed the way I think about running. And so a fair few of my listeners are health professionals because they've taken away a lot of those interviews really well. And even some of the concepts and solo episodes that I do trying to communicate to runners, health professionals have found it really beneficial as well. So the podcast would be a good one to start with.
Perfect. It was really nice chatting with you and really valuable information. Thanks, Brodie, for taking the time for this podcast.
Thanks for having me on. Had a lot of fun.